place is nowhere. And it's forever.
Ghosts of my life.
I'm Steven, and this is Marlowe, and we are Lost Futures, a Mark Fisher podcast.
That's, in fact, what the podcast is called.
Right. This is our second chapter of the book. Well, third chapter.
The third chapter, chapter 2.
Chapter 2.
Hauntology.
Hauntology. And yeah, it's the big term in this book that really this book kind of popularized in a lot of ways outside of a niche group of music writers and Derrida scholars.
I mean, I guess a quick overview of the structure and context of the chapter. What will follow is essentially a sets of 2 sections where he briefly talks about a band, usually an article that he did at one point on the band at a time when an album came out.
Yep.
And then he will have sort of an interview with the band for the next section. It's kind of an essay where he did an interview and he uses quotes from the interview to write his essay, but
well, it doesn't happen for every artist in the chapter.
Oh, okay.
There's a couple others that he just does standalone K-punk articles that are edited, but he does it for at least 3. There are 3 artists that he does a positive review of one of their albums, and then he will pair that with an interview with the artist. You know, he'll do standalones that he also thinks relates to hauntology, and he's using here kind of a specific way of talking about hauntology,
right,
which I think we should talk about first.
Yeah, so it was one of those things where people go, well, it's not really a genre when explaining it to you.
Yeah.
I think is the best way to describe it. But it was a set of artists out of the England electronic scene in the early 2000s that were identified by certain writers, generally in the greater space of The Wire, as well as a few other publications, as well as independent music blogs that were also working within this space. And the short story is it's a group of artists. Most of them are associated with a particular label called Ghostbox.
Ghostbox Records.
But not all of them are. They're more or less all electronic artists. They sound a certain way that if you had a roommate in college who was into that sort of music, you've kind of heard it before.
Marlowe's speaking from personal experience.
Yes.
They were very hip.
Yeah, I mean, like, it was early 2000s, they were cutting edge in England, and then they came over to the Pitchfork world.
Yeah, I was going to say it's
late 2000s.
If you don't know The Wire, it's kind of like, and one of the things that was going on was a bunch of music writers that wrote for this.
But to your point, yeah, it did come over to the essentially Pitchfork scene of the mid to late 2000s in the United States.
Yeah.
And much of the same artists were given similar praise, and there was also presumably a back and forth dialogue between artists, I'm sure.
Yeah, and we listened to, there was a panel discussion from 2010 that we listened to where there were a bunch of these blogosphere writers who popularized this term and had slightly different definitions. Right. Mark Fisher being one of them.
Right, and they were all from the English version of Silicon Valley drug head cultural theorists,
yeah,
for lack of a better term, but you know, and they came at it from different standpoints. Mark Fisher, not an insult, but you know, he came from a background of reading a lot of books and taking a lot of drugs and doing philosophy,
yeah,
about sci-fi and thinking that's really cool. So you know,
I mean,
he was in the scene.
There were other ones there that had funny handles or blogs.
Yeah, they all had their handles that they got introduced by at this fucking event. And it was super 2000s.
Yeah, and it was so funny because it did have a bit of a nostalgia listening to it.
Incredibly, this was a sort of thing that happened in the 2000s.
Like blogosphere people in a panel discussion sponsored by
Neither here nor there. That's why he's talking about these fucking bands.
Because they all called a certain aesthetic or a certain group of artists who shared an aesthetic hauntology.
And I will be willing to say that we have been purposely being non-specific about exactly what makes these bands hauntological, because that's what we're going to do by exploring the things that Mark Fisher wrote.
Yep.
Rather than me just sort of pondering.
So we get to the first essay in the third chapter, London After the Rave, Burial. And it comes from a K-Punk post, to get back to the blogosphere, from April 14th, 2006.
After the release of Burial's first of 2 total albums.
Right.
This one being self-titled.
Yeah, self-titled record, which was voted Wire's #1 album of the year in 2006.
Yes.
So that's sort of the context. And let me tell you, Mark Fisher loves this album.
Yeah, he really likes
He really loves this album.
He also really likes the next album. He likes a lot of things. But,
let's get into it. Burial is the kind of album I've dreamt of for years. Literally.
Yeah, he starts off strong with these pros. But he, starts grounding it specifically with Max and Quay, Tricky, which he's talked about earlier.
Yeah. Tricky, previous episode, go back to episode 2. It's the Jungle episode.
Yes.
He sees a reference point from Jungle to this, to Burial and hauntology that he established in the last chapter and now is saying, okay, it's 2006. What's progress look like after Jungle music?
Over the course of this essay, he will, in fact, conclude with Burial essentially achieved what Tricky tried to, but couldn't.
I think he specifically...
I think he said, but couldn't.
Massive Attack, specifically.
Massive Attack.
Which Tricky was a member of.
So he mentions that. He mentions, the crackle.
Crackleology.
Yes.
Which is one of his puncepts that he's trying to do a hauntology, but put crackle in there.
Yeah, but anyway, then he gets into,
or I guess it's ideology.
Right? He references the press release, A Near Future South London Underwater. And I think that kind of really gets into a lot of the imagery he evokes for a lot of the rest of this.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of my favorite things about this essay itself is the way he describes London as the most depressing place in the world.
Well, and getting into hauntology, he says Burial is haunted by once was, what could have been, and most keeningly what could still happen.
The album is like a faded 10-year-old tag of a kid whose rave dreams have been crushed by a series of dead-end jobs.
Right, and I think this is like a very specific tension that he builds through his descriptions overall. I mean, he has another banger of a half paragraph I'll read later on, but just this tension. Well, I mean, the title, London After the Rave, I guess. This idea of being grown up kind of sucks, but not necessarily nostalgia, because it's really not about being a kid was good, but what you thought being an adult was better. I've always thought of it as, listeners, if you've ever been to a rave and you've felt the amount of endorphins, the amount of drugs in your system, the dancing, this kind of manic
celebratory thing where you're vibing with people on the dance floor until 5 o'clock in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, and you're all amped up. You have these epiphanies, you have these kind of delusions of grandeur about what life could be.
The girl that you love, like, thinks that maybe you guys could work.
Yeah, or that, everything's gonna be okay and that you could just go to all the raves and your life will be better if you just keep going to raves. And I think here he's saying, well, the hangover, what's the hangover? London after the rave. What happens when those dreams on the dance floor never take root and never come to fruition? What you end up with is people who were promised a life of prosperity and you end up in dead-end jobs that you don't want to go to. You end up in a precarious situation, living on people's couches, living, basically homeless from one place to another. And, the failed sons of London are what ends up being in, I think he mentions it later, but, new labor and austerity.
Yeah, but okay, so I think that there's something even more ontological about this. Like, not to sound like a jackass, but there's something very poignant in his Jacob's Ladder reference.
Well, what is the Jacob's Ladder reference?
I mean, I've never seen the movie, but I know there's a point where there's this shot of demons coming through the New York subway system or some shit. But anyway, just the idea that kind of behind this city of broken dreams is sort of the dreams. Well, okay, MDMA flashbacks bring London to unlife in a way that hallucinogens brought demons crawling out of the subways in Jacob's Ladder's New York. Just this, the album kind of, for him, is invoking this, washed out broken dreams, but in that promise of what could have been.
Yeah. The expectations of prosperity and all these things that you're sold of as a kid, that you're expected to have as a child by your parents who did achieve those things in the 80s and 90s, and then waking up to find yourself still living with your parents or having a string of bad relationships or having a string of bad jobs. I think there's...
And then he also mentioned Stalker, so that's another horror, right?
Yeah, it's one of the greatest. I've always wanted to see it.
I mean, where he does mention movies...
They're all horror movies.
Right, and then also in this, he kind of sort of contrasts it with dubstep, which I guess would be the Raven being.
Yeah. Burial's mourning and melancholia sets it apart from dubstep's emotional autism and austerity.
It is this sort of unordered, unrelenting just energy versus, reflecting and being within the haunted space, I guess.
Yeah, the absent presence. And you're no longer on the dance floor, you're in the abandoned factory that you had the dance floor in the night before. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'll just read from him the part that I liked. Burial's London is a wounded city, populated by ecstasy casualties on day release from psychiatric units, disappointed lovers on night buses, parents who can't quite bring themselves to sell their rave 12 inches at a car boot sale, all of them with haunted looks on their face, but also haunting their impassively nihilist kids with the thought that things weren't always like this.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah, and I feel like that is sort of this tension of, is the dream dead? Can we reclaim the dream by remembering when we had the dream?
And how do we do that?
Move forward by making a new dream, and how can we do that? And just then, for him, Burial is trying to answer this question.
Then he drops the Silent Hill reference, which I think you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, so he drops it in a list of Mark Fisher has made a reference to fucking everything by now, of just... if there's a thing that sort of invokes dreary, Mark Fisher has sort of mentioned it.
Jacob's Ladder, Stalker. Stalker also has that type of, I've seen some of it, it has that type of fog over the entire kind of Russian landscape.
In this case, he actually doesn't even mention any of the visuals from Silent Hill. I just thought it was weird because I've never seen Mark Fisher, like, acknowledge that video games existed before. And then, like, Silent Hill is just staring me in the face, and, like, I had to look up, like, was this originally a movie? No. The movie came after? Was this something else? I'm pretty sure he's talking about the video game, but he's just talking to just the, like, kind of off-kilter metronome in an abandoned Silent Hill school. He later has a thing in his interview that I'll get into that I feel like is sort of this interesting parallel to Silent Hill. That, yeah, we'll note for now, but get back to later.
So a lot of abandoned places, a lot of absences, a lot of dreary, rainy, just a very sad state of affairs that he sees in this music. And he then goes into Codwo Eshin's, who we've talked about in previous, which is the Adventures in Sonic Millennium, I think. But yeah, he talks about how the sound of the bass, the Hoover bass and No U-Turn, is subdued in Burial, and that subdued aspect kind of brings an echo and like a similar type of thing where it's haunting the music more than it's pulsating.
Yeah,
that's
sure.
fairly accurate to Burial. And then we get into another reference of dreary horror.
Yeah, just Nigel Cook, who was an artist in England who, like, I think he said he was inspired by the idea of graffiti, but his paintings don't necessarily look like that. I don't know. They're kind of surreal. They're not happy paintings.
No.
Generally speaking.
They're very sad paintings and
Google them.
Yeah. I think that you pointed this out yesterday where Mark Fisher and a lot of British culture kind of does this thing where high art kind of looks at...
And I feel like this kind of dances along the edges of what we're reading. You know, I don't think it's necessary to, like, really, you know, explore this for this chapter. But there does seem to be a thing with a lot of, especially the bands he's covering and the culture he covers, of high culturizing American black art for an English audience. And specifically in this case, hip hop, graffiti, related cultures of the 80s and 90s that then, you know, even he mentioned it in an earlier chapter that he always felt the term trip hop invoked this classy hip hop, this hip hop with the black elements, i.e. rapping removed.
Yeah.
Were his words. So I'm not even making this up or saying that, like, he's doing it or
well,
anything.
he says it here, Burial's dilapidated Afro-no-futurism does for London in the 2000s what Wu-Tang did for New York in the 90s.
Yeah, sure, man.
That is a bold statement.
That is a fucking bold statement. I was not in London in the 2000s. I have no idea if that's true. If anyone listens to this, they were in London in the 2000s, let me know if that is correct. I can probably find someone who was in Staten Island in the 90s.
Yeah, right?
And you guys can compare notes. We'll do an experiment.
But it gets to your point about the links he made in previous chapters about this transatlantic...
Yeah, I mean, there's also, of course, this obviously echoes British blues rock of the 1960s,
Eric Clapton.
taking 30-plus-year-old traditions from the United States. Clapton, Zeppelin,
yeah.
The Who, I mean, like,
Black
they all
Sabbath.
they all did it. Not saying it's bad.
It was the
thing they did.
It was the hip thing that the hip kids were doing, and this is just continuing the tradition.
Yeah, or it's something else. It's just an interesting coincidence. A pathology of the British mind. I have no idea.
For any of our British listeners, he's laughing right now. A decade ago, jungle and hip-hop invoked devils, demons, and angels, which we're going to get into in the next section. There's a lot of angels in the second album that Burial brings up. But Mark Fisher says here, Burial's sound, however, summons the chain-smoking plants and sobbing vegetables that sigh longingly in Nigel Cook's painting.
Yeah, and just because I did do that aside, to drag it out a little bit, a lot of Nigel Cook's conceit, at least initially or whatever, seems to have been based in this idea of doing oil versions of graffiti work. So, you know, just another kind of okay, interesting.
He finishes off with his big endorsement of this album, which I feel like he sort of had to write.
I mean, his big endorsement was it does for London in the 2000s what Wu-Tang did for New York in the 90s.
It's everything that Goldie's Timeless ought to have been. It's the Dub City counterpart to Lumo's Velocity. Burial is one of the albums of the decade. Trust me.
And what I said, it delivers what
Massive Attack promised but never really achieved. It is one of the albums of the decade. He loves this record more than sliced bread. And
more
in the
than
next
methamphetamines.
Yeah, white bread with methamphetamines in it.
More than Nick Land.
Anyways, so for the next section, we'll get you the interview with Burial. And we'll play you out.
Sometimes you gotta stick with the ancient ways. Now you understand me?
Alright, we're back. And that was Untrue from the album Untrue by Burial, which is what album just came out when this essay or interview came out in The Wire in December of 2007.
Part
Second
2
album
of the Burial section would be, part 1 was April 2006, this is December 2007.
It's called Downcast Angel, Interview with Burial.
Yeah, so this is after Burial's second and what would be his final LP so far.
Well, he's had a number of collaborations and EPs since then. His most recent EP, Anti-Dawn, is pretty good too.
When did that come out?
This year.
Interesting.
It's very good.
Yeah.
But he hasn't had a full length since this album.
Yeah.
And the other thing we didn't mention is that Burial is legendary. In terms of DJ circles, he is well regarded as an auteur in the craft.
If you're listening to this and just enraged at the lackadaisical way that me, especially me, and Steven are dealing with Burial, I am so sorry. This isn't, necessarily my kind of music. I listen to the albums and I approach everything with an open mind. It reminded me of a kind of music that I've listened to before, but, I didn't hate it or anything.
But he's well regarded as an artist among the type of DJs that you might see in a DIY rave scene.
To those listeners, I just want to say, I could dance to some Steve McCoy or whatever the fuck.
So this one is an interview with him, and you were saying this new journalism.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a way that I've read an article like this before, but it's often written in this very, I was sitting across from so-and-so in a cafe. They ordered an espresso and began talking about blah, 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 and blah, 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 whereas this isn't even that. He's like writing a critical essay, an analytical essay, using presumably a transcript of an interview that he did do that he has, but he's not printing it here, but he's using quotes from it to then flesh out his essay about Burial.
Appropriately so. It's
I've seen that done as a story before, but there's no real story here. It's just
quotes.
This is the context of Burial. Something, something, Burial says. This is the context of that. It's an analytical essay that uses an interview he did as a source, but...
Right, and that to me is an interesting framing because it's making Burial himself an authority on his own music in a way. Mark Fisher's going into the interview I'm trying to get to the bottom of what makes Burial tick, basically. Urges, or what's the motivations behind...
what's this mean?
Yeah, what's this mean? Why is Burial? To be or not to be Burial?
Is the album good? Why is it good? Why should you listen to it? Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, it's a thing about his music.
But it's also an argument. He's making an argument for this music being a certain type of hauntological. He's making.
Anyway, what we're really saying is this is called Interview with Burial, and on the first page, there's not a single quote of Burial.
No. It's
so
completely
like,
just he goes.
Yeah, so anyway, released an LP last year called Burial. Now he released a new one, signed to Code 9 Hyperdubs labels.
Which is a dubstep.
Which is generally a dubstep label. However, as I will argue, Burial isn't really dubstep. And also most people kind of agree with that, but he's associated because he was on a dubstep label.
And then he mentions that it's the record of the year, which again, like, points back to the last essay, The Wire's record of the year for 2006. And now he talks about how...
Oh, and also at the time, Burial was wholly anonymous.
And remains so, and probably until this essay.
No, he's got. If you look him up on Wikipedia, he's got his name listed. But at the time, he straight up was entirely.
And I think
that
I think that adds to the effect of the, like.
Right. Well, I mean, it's briefly mentioned that there was like a rumor that Burial didn't really exist, that he was just a project from the other artists on the label.
Yeah. Many didn't believe he actually existed, attributing the record's production to Basic Channel, The Bug, Code 9 himself, a massive backhanded compliment to how fully realized Burial's synesthetic was.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, he really goes into his career and his personal life, but also you don't know anything about his personal life once you start getting into him.
Yeah, it's... I'm commenting on the structure of this, but I mean, essentially his Tricky interview was done the same way.
Yeah.
But the Tricky interview, in contrast to this, was actually incredibly autobiographical, or biographical, I guess. It talked about Tricky as a person in his life quite a bit, and this really stays away from that with Burial.
Right. Are we at the Burial's refusal to be a face?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's expounding on his choice of anonymity.
Yeah.
And then it gets into the next interesting thing, I think, which is the idea of Burial viewing himself as strongly inspired by British music, British electronic music, and the British hardcore continuum.
Yeah.
Which, in the first section, also Fisher mentioned Burial as an elegy to the hardcore continuum. So
right.
That's sort of a...
And hardcore continuum is a term that Simon Reynolds came up with and wrote a
we briefly mentioned it, I think, in the first episode.
It clearly had an effect on
Right,
Mark
anyway,
Fisher.
It was in the similar way to hauntological music, but it was just, I'd say, backed up to the early 90s rather than the early 2000s.
He wrote like 7 essays over 15 years about different types of music, driving this continuum from hardcore music or like...
Well, like the 70s post-punk.
Post-punk to like jungle. And so he's seeing this as almost the end of the hardcore continuum. And then there's
the continuation of it. Yeah, well, the interesting thing about this, he says... Without being chauvinistic, Burial is fiercely loyal to the British hardcore continuum. And then he does quote Burial, essentially kind of giving this like pro-UK over US thing.
Yeah.
And again, describing American hip-hop as I'm in the club with your girl type thing. Which again, I think gets into this very interesting...
relationship.
Relationship between... At this time, American hip-hop, but in past times, other African-American music and culture, and British, not just copying it, but kind of reconstituting it into this different, higher cultural plane to them for their audience. But anyway.
I will say, I read the anonymity thing as kind of a cliched pretentiousness about Burial, which I find familiar to a lot of DJ experiences that I've had. And this also, seeing themselves in contrast to another type of music that they want to be better than, also has a kind of like, well, I'm not necessarily pretentious, but like I'm doing art rather than...
Right, well, everything else, according to him, once you've heard that underground music in your life, other stuff just sounds like a fucking advert, imported. Or however he said it.
I'd rather hear a tune about real life, about the UK, than some US hip-hop.
I'm in the
club with your girl type thing. I love the R&B tunes and vocals, but I hear... Sorry, we're doing just bad British.
Yeah, well, you know what? He's like saying some like stuff about us. I'm just
not
saying.
About us specifically.
Yeah, not about, but about our boys.
In the club.
Yeah, but like, I don't know. Anyway, it's an interesting relationship the British have with American black music.
Yeah, there are 2 tracks on Untrue called UK and Raver that he brings up that are specifically calling back to what Mark Fisher talked about in the last section.
To not beat up on it, but just he does place himself within this British electronic scene.
He seems self-aware of what Mark Fisher is talking about with regards to him.
Yeah, I mean...
Almost like...
Yeah, as contextualized in an essay about what Mark Fisher is talking about, I'd say quite poignantly.
Yeah.
I mean, whether or not Burial's saying it or whatever, there's a thesis that's being driven at that is effectively being driven at.
Burial's London seems to be a city populated by dejected ravers, returning to the sites of former revels and finding them derelict, forced to contrast the quotidian compromises of their post-rave life with the collective ecstasy they once lived out. Burials is a redreaming of the past, a condensation of relics of abandoned genres into an honoric montage.
Oneric. It means masturbatory.
His sound is a work of mourning rather than of melancholia, because he still longs for the lost object, still refuses to abandon the hope that it will return. This is something we keep going back to.
Right, yeah. So
essays.
This, I would say, is kind of the little thread that drives through both of these essays and perhaps this entire book of remembering the future from the past and using that to remember a new future at the present. And, in many ways, Mark Fisher's project was, how do we create a new left when everything seems hopeless? And, this is kind of speaking to that.
Yeah. He'll get into it in a little bit, but he does link it to a larger political project. Mm-hmm. He talks about, rave culture as a way of creating one's new type of underground folklore, rumor, because those ravers were at the edge of their lives. They weren't running ahead or falling behind. They were just right there, and the tunes meant everything. In the 90s, you could feel that. It had been taken away from them.
Yeah, man, we didn't have Uber back then.
In club culture, it all became like super clubs, magazines, trance, commercialized. All these designer bars would be trying to be like clubs. It all got just taken. And this, I think, gets to one of Mark Fisher's larger things, specifically about his teenage years and 20s, about the promises that were offered by these ecstasy culture, MDMA culture, this belief that we're striving towards a better world by doing these things, mm-hmm. which he's having a non-nostalgic way of looking back, that we had those dreams, but now those dreams are they became
enough.
They became squalor.
Mm-hmm. But it also wasn't enough in many ways because it was taken from you.
Yeah. Which is one of the things that he often gets, criticized for, is when he says something has been taken from you. Mm-hmm. It's oftentimes reflexively like, what are you saying? It was better then than it is now? And,
right.
And I think this essay is laying out both, that it was in a lot of ways better, but in a lot of ways...
I feel like almost his distinction in the last section about dubstep, and just...
commercialization.
It's not that dubstep's commercialized. No, it was that dubstep is music for dancing in the club rather than this reflection.
Yeah.
And... if Burial wanted to make fun club music, Burial could make fun club music. He's not saying, oh, remember fun club music? That was nice. Like, when he evokes the rave, he's not saying, hey, here's an escapism to feel how you did in the rave.
Well, one of the things in that panel that we listened to that caught my ear that isn't a part of this is the utopianness of that type of... Like, if we just make the rave everywhere, then there's a type of utopian idea behind a lot of this music.
I don't think that's what Mark Fisher was saying.
Right, that was other people that were saying that if we look back at the utopian 60s, if we look back at the utopian 90s, that we have this positive optimism about the future that...
Right, you need hope for the future, but you also need other stuff too, and you need to make that positive thing happen. But you do need to start with at least having an idea that things could be better.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the difference. And simply dancing in a rave that, is a thing that's technically still legal to do is not going to do that.
Right.
And that's not what evoking the rave is for Burial, according to Mark Fisher.
Right. So then we get into the album. We're finally at Untrue. He compares it to the first album, saying that it's substantially modifies, which I agree. It is a substantial leap and bound of better quality of sound, certainly. It sounds like professionally made rather than kind of like DIY. And then he talks about the voices, and a lot of the second album has more vocals.
The second album just generally, he's clearly like playing with vocals as a instrument.
And one of the tunes, perhaps the best tune or the most well-known tune, he talks about the story behind it, which I thought was one of the most touching moments or sad moments. My dog died, and I was totally gutted about it. And my mom was just like, make a tune, cheer up, stay up late, make a cup of tea. And I rang her mobile 20 minutes later. I made that Archangel tune. And I was like, I've made the tune you told me to make. And so I'm going to play a little of Archangel now for context. So he talks about the voice, but he also talks about the crackle, something we haven't really talked about a lot here. But Mark Fisher puts a lot of importance in the crackle because he sees it as part of the ideology behind hauntology.
Well, it's interesting because he's kind of mentioning something in a positive light that he mentioned in a negative light when applied to a different band.
Yeah. The Arctic Monkeys.
Yeah, like that kind of thing. But, he is making a distinction, I guess, where in this case, and we'll get into, but it kind of comes out of this, at the very least, if not limitations, then process, versus using it because you've heard it before and you know that's a cultural signifier that makes up a cultural product that you're making. And, the thing I mentioned earlier about Silent Hill is finally coming back because this is an interesting quote from Burial.
But it's not a quote of his, it's just...
Well, it gets into a quote of his. Self-deprecatingly, he claims that he initially used the crackle to conceal, quote, the fact that I wasn't very good at making tunes. And, Mark Fisher did mention Silent Hill earlier, and if you are familiar, the first Silent Hill game especially was very well known visually for its heavy use of distance fog, which is a technique in older 3D video games where they used fog essentially to limit the distance that the player could see, which allowed them to render less things on the screen, which allowed the game to run faster. And usually the distance fog in most of these games was just arbitrarily placed on because they needed it for technical reasons. But Silent Hill being a survival horror game, kind of set in this Lovecraftian New England setting, very much used the distance fog for both the technical reasons, but also as a stylistic thing. And I thought that was just an interesting, overlap between the two. But then, as you were saying as well.
Yeah, I was saying that it gets into what he would talk about post-punk and how it required a DIY, almost proletarian art that had punk in general not needing technical skills.
Also even just the general fact that it was recorded in the early 80s and their technology wasn't as good as
right,
today.
The limitations.
Versus, the trope of using technology to sound old. Which is kind of what Burial is doing here.
What you were saying about Arctic Monkeys using the crackle is simulating the past because they're using the technology and trying to simulate this kind of, past type of music that they like to recreate, whereas Burial is using it organically to hide the fact that he doesn't have the skills or the technology or the money to make the type of music that he wants to fully realize. And so it becomes an organic part of his sound out of necessity rather than
even though it is still
artificial.
In many ways a simulated crackle.
Yeah, it's extremely simulated and it still evokes this kind of implanted artificiality to the sound, but at the same time it's there for a specific purpose. Mm-hmm. The next section I think is very interesting because this is where Mark Fisher brings in the political angle of it. New Labour Britain is intoxicated by consensual sentimentality, hooked on disposable simulated emotion. This is kind of just what we were talking about, that he's drawing this distinction between simulating how you feel through music and culture with an entire ideology behind basically liberalism or Blairism in Britain during this time, where Burial seems to both be capturing the zeitgeist of the time, but also organically adding to it by using it.
Challenging the status quo, at least in some way.
Yeah. By using the same tricks to kind of recontextualize the zeitgeist in a different way, which I find...
Yeah, which also, he's again getting into this distinction between what I think is hauntology versus nostalgia, of if you want the creature comforts of nostalgia... even more so today with, Marvel and this, that, and the other thing, we live in a world that's saturated by nostalgia, but that's not what we're talking about.
No. He gets into it, which made me think of Tricky with the next section where he talks about, I like pitching down female vocals so they sound male, and pitching up male vocals so they sound like a girl singing. That, to me, if you contrast that with the way Tricky uses vocals, has a...
Yeah, there was a similar...
echo.
And, it also kind of, again, gets into this... In the Tricky article, he then spent a paragraph and a half giving this whole biographical reason behind this, whereas here he just sort of likes it.
He states it. Yeah, yes. He just states it as a matter of fact.
Here it's a thing he does, and also it gives this sense of inhumanness, or at least transcendent humanness, which gets into the theme of angels and demons.
Yeah, there's just an interesting gendered, and he mentions that angels are supposed to be degendered. And
right.
The half boy, half girl.
Right, it's this transcendent humanity where it doesn't sound bad, but it doesn't sound natural.
And there's one point that's funny here, to get into the Angels thing, where Burial says, mates laugh at me because I like whale songs, but I love them.
Yeah,
I like
it sounds
vocals
so
to
cool.
be like that, like the night cry and an angel animal. And so here we go. This section reminded me of the David Peace part, because David Peace chapter had a lot of angels to it as well.
Yeah, also I'd say in the sense of hauntology as geography and place hauntology, like that was sort of a thing that he got into with Peace, with making the city a subject.
Yeah.
And
London
and
becomes...
Burial does that with both albums quite a bit. Because when we're talking about hauntology and hauntedness, I mean, you know, most of our ghost stories are about like a haunted place, a haunted house. So it's sort of, you know, transcribing that to making place important.
The setting becomes a character.
Yeah, and I thought that was, kind of present in both the piece and this.
Yeah, and so he gets into Angels, and Angels is all over David Peace and the Red Riding series, but here he talks about it. My new tunes are all about that. Wanting an angel to be watching over you when there's nowhere to go and all you can do is sit in McDonald's late at night not answering your phone. And he has a tune on there called McDonald's, which I assume is just the experience. It's supposed to be the experience of that. Or capturing...
it kind of gives a Nighthawks the painting feeling, as I mentioned, and then looked up the name of the painting, Nighthawks.
He gets into a little bit of biography where he says his attunement to angels, demons, and ghosts goes back to childhood. And then he gets into some weird story about a lock-in. Like, he has ghost stories. He likes ghost stories. There's nothing worse for a human being than to see a face where it doesn't belong. But if you're little and you've got an imagination which is always messing you up and darking you out, things like that are always comforting to read. So the comfort in the thing that scares you.
Yeah, I guess one exception to this being non-biographical would just be the fact that he is talking about how much ghost stories meant to him as a little kid and how that kind of feeds into his music.
Yeah, his dad is really big on it.
So, that's an exception to what I said earlier.
The Lock-In also had a
biographical
I mean,
basically
story.
He was doing a fun thing with kids and when he was a kid and all the kids started telling ghost stories.
And it stuck with him.
Yeah.
Then we get into how this is hauntological for Mark Fisher. This is him bringing it home. The last page and a half. Burial makes the most convincing case that our zeitgeist is essentially hauntological. The power of Derrida's concept lay in its idea of being haunted by events that had not actually happened, futures that failed to materialize and reimagine and actually remain spectral. Burials crave something he has never actually experienced firsthand. I've never been to a festival, a rave in a field, a big warehouse, or an illegal party, he says. Just clubs and playing tunes, indoor or whatever. I heard about it, dreamed about it. See, Mark Fisher dreamed about this album, and now Burial's dreaming about the things that he wrote the songs about. You know, my brother might bring back these records that seemed really adult to me, and I couldn't believe I had them. It was like when you first saw Terminator or Alien when you're only little. This was another thing linking back to Tricky and Goldie.
We're getting a lot of callbacks.
Callbacks to Terminator, Alien, this kind of 80s futuristic dystopian kind of thing. I'd get a rush from it. I was hearing this other world, and my brother would drop by late, and I'd fall asleep listening to tunes he put on. The rave was kind of a present absence, which gets into Derrida's kind of obsession with the present absence that is central to hauntology. So the fact that he never experienced the rave, but seems in his music to be obsessed. Yeah, I mean, I feel like that was
when he was a kid.
Yeah.
That's how he got it. He's talking about how he got into electronic music. music. I feel like the man's been to a rave.
No, he just said, I've never been to a festival. A rave in a field.
I feel like...
Are you going to challenge the...
No, because again, this gets into how this whole thing is laid out and how these quotes are kind of not necessarily entirely in the context in which they were spoken. I feel like he's talking about his childhood, getting it into electronic music. At the time, I've never been to a rave, but my brother was talking about it.
That's not how it reads here.
I think
he's saying
ambiguous.
in the present, I've never... He also seems like somebody that never has been to a rave or a festival.
Maybe, I don't know. I mean, I guess he was fucking anonymous at the time.
He was anonymous, and he...
I happen to have read it the other way.
To me, like, the whole thing is set up that he's a loner, he doesn't like to come out of his shell, he doesn't like to give a name to his own, like, personality, he just likes to kind of disappear into his music, and it makes sense to me that a person like that wouldn't go to a festival, wouldn't go to a rave, because those are nightmares for people who don't like to be around people, and he seems like somebody that doesn't like to be around people. I'm reading it not he's talking from his childhood self.
Well, then he immediately starts getting into stories about his child.
Yeah, and
I had never been to a rave, but my brother always brought home this music that was cool to me. Seems like a way that he could have been saying.
But I think that is how he came up with the idea of writing songs specifically about the rave. I think he's contextualizing that not because he's been to a rave, but he's imagining a world where he's been to a rave and how he would write music about it.
Right.
It
also seems like just how he got into doing music, which seems like the part of the interview it was. When I was a kid, this is what happens.
I think both things can be true.
Yes, it's ambiguously written.
Well, speaking of ambiguously written, the last 2 paragraphs of this are the most bonkers things in the entire essay. To go back to my point, as a kid, he likes to dream about being put in bins, escaping from things without my mom knowing she'd put me in the bins. And then Fisher... He
basically wanted to do that thing where they escape from prison by hiding in the laundry thing.
Yeah.
And then getting thrown in the back of a truck and getting driven off.
Yeah, but he just wants to escape for escaping's sake, it seems like.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a very strange part of the interview.
It's very weird to end it on this.
Yeah, it was... I don't know, you guys should all read this. It's interesting.
But Fisher also immediately links it to returning to the womb, kind of Freudian. He says thinly coated, but I don't think that's thinly coated at all.
Yeah, and then Burial likes taking long walks on the beach, but phrasing it weird.
This is one of the most ambiguous things, but there are always flickers and flashes of the other side, after images. Quote, I used to get taken away to the middle of nowhere by the sea, concludes Burial. I love it out there, because when it's dark, it's totally dark. There's none of this ambient light, London thing. We used to have a walk back and hold hands and use a lighter. See the light? See where you were, and then you'd walk on, and the image of where you'd just been would still be on your retina. He doesn't finish the quote there, which is...
Yeah, interesting.
I mean, I know sort of what he's feeling like. It's how I've felt when I used to go to my...
Oh, it's a physical effect. It's how flashbangs work. Go in a bathroom with no windows, like close the door and shit, turn the light on for a bit, then just like turn it off, like, and do that a couple times, and it'll like, you'll get like literally just an image against your eyes of what you were just looking at that will slowly melt away. That's just like how your eyes work.
No, I mean more like the feeling of being in a darkened field after living in the city for a long time and having and seeing the stars for the first time and being taken away by the sky being kind of massive and like imposing but also like calming. I don't know, there's something I can relate to having grown up around a city and going out to the country, which for him is like going to the sea and kind of enjoying the...
Yeah. He likes taking walks on the beach at night. You don't need to, like, convince me that that's nice. Yes, taking walks on the beach at night is lovely.
Yeah.
I never said it wasn't.
But I don't know if it's ambiguous what he means. It's very poetic.
Yeah, well, I mean, I also think it just generally feeds into this London underwater, rain, drizzly, calm, melancholic, but not melancholic, but melancholic, like the, sound of like rain hitting against the roof when you're inside on a rainy day, or, that kind of just general, like, ambient silence thing that is sort of like his music as well.
Next week, we're going to get into even more ambient music with The Caretaker.
Do you want to hear about another British electronic artist with a name that sounds sort of Norwegian black metal?
Who makes 6.5 hour long albums.
Awesome.
And 9 hour long albums about retrograde amnesia.
Cool.
And the haunted...
Next week, Buckethead.
No, it's Caretaker.
Yes. Spangle.
What angel of the